Right. My name is Robert Brockway. I'm the President of the Australian Men's Rights Association and one of the organisers of the International Conference for Men's Issues 2021. Today with us we have Natalie Powell, who is a guest interviewer, and we have Bettina Arndt. Natalie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so as Rob said, my name's Natalie. Rob and I have known each other for a few years now through social media, met her personally at the March for Men, and we also co-host the Tackle Box, which can be found on YouTube and Facebook.
Bettina, thank you very much for joining us today.
I'm very happy to be here. Nice to meet you, Natalie.
Nice to meet you.
So Bettina started out as one of Australia's first sex therapists. Later, she became a media personality in Australia and then lived in the US for a while before returning to Australia. Later, she became an advocate for men's issues. So to start off, I'm actually going to quote you from 1984, Bettina. So in 1984, you were quoted as having said, "Look at what's happening to men and women in bed today. It wouldn't surprise me at all if more and more males chose to stick to their beer. Sex is fast becoming a battlefield, with women calling more of the shots." So that was nearly 40 years ago that you said that. How do you feel things have turned out? Taking that into
Very badly. I don't even think that sex is much of a battlefield. I think women have decided to leave the field, unfortunately, in a lot of marriages. I mean, that's one of the great tragedies for me, watching what happened over this 40, 50-year period, where, for instance, with sex moved from being a wifely duty to a situation where women feel absolutely entitled to say no to sex if they're not interested. And the whole notion of mutual obligation, caring for your partner, being generous to your partner, all of that has gone out the window. But I mean, sex is, in a way, sex is indicative of the bigger issue of the shift in power in relationships. And of course, the most devastating consequence of that has been women choosing to leave their relationships when they're not happy, and the appalling impact on our society of impact on children. But I suppose which is obviously really concerns me, but of course I've been fighting it for years about the problems for men of a divorce system increasingly weaponized in women's favor. So all bad news, I'm afraid. It's terrible, I used to be such a cheerful soul, and I was, in my days when I talked about sex, I was renowned for making people laugh, and I never make people laugh anymore. It's really sad.
Actually, you touch on a really good point there, actually, with regards to the effect on the family breakup on children. I think the data's awful, isn't it, in terms of the effect that it has, on the children from fatherlessness.
Yeah, I mean, when I started writing, 40, 50 years ago, that was the sort of 70s, and we were all very optimistic, and, a good divorce is better for children than a bad marriage, and, the idea that it was all going to be very civilized, and children are very adaptable. Wow, boy, has it not worked out like that. I'm not saying there aren't some very civilized divorces that aren't really good parents. There are very good parents who bend over backwards to put their children as the absolute priority and find ways to help them deal with what is inevitably a crisis in most children's lives, to have the parents' marriage break up. But unfortunately, we've seen, I think the whole battleground of divorce has got worse. I think it's become a highly lucrative area of practice for lawyers. We've seen more and more law, the divorce laws have been tilted to enable women to get away with shifting things dramatically in their favour by making false allegations, for instance. And that's been the biggest shift that I've been involved in, or that I've observed over the last few decades. I was heavily involved in family law back in the 1980s when we had a Prime Minister, John Howard, who was very interested in social issues. I mean, the only Prime Minister we've really ever had who saw this as one of the critical areas of his governance, I suppose. And he put in some major reforms in family law, and particularly in terms of joint parental responsibility and shifting towards joint custody in a sense, or shared parenting after divorce. And of course, I mean, it was all pretty miraculous at the time, and boy, did that get thrown out the window when they lost power and the Labor Party moved back in. It was just tragic, and it's got worse since then.
That's right. As you say, like a lot of those laws that John Howard put in were actually wound back, weren't they?
Absolutely. Well, the violence card turned out to be the big weapon that feminists used by. I mean, essentially, the argument was that it was dangerous for children to be with a violent father, and if you made an accusation of violence, you could get the man removed from the home. It would be often years before he saw his child, and the whole thing was stacked against him, and it gave her, very often a greater proportion of the assets, and so it went on. And boy, it worked a treat. I mean, I must say, I sit back and watch this juggernaut of feminism mowing down every aspect of our legal system, marching through all our institutions. I'm just gobsmacked. And you have to admire them, don't you, in a peculiar sort of way. I mean, I had no idea what we were in for.
I agree. It is amazing when you really sit back and you look at what's happened, and you really think, why weren't men objecting? The Prime Minister actually used to reference the quiet Australians, and I'm actually going to mention that later on. And it raises the question, why haven't more people stood up?
Yeah, well, that's a long story, because, that's essentially about the victims we're talking about are men. The victims are fathers. And this is one of the big issues, that how few people care about men, how few people are prepared to publicly defend men. And that, of course, most importantly, applies to men too.
Yes.
Powerful men who still run our countries are very reluctant to advocate for men, or to be seen as advocating for men. And it's a whole lot of complex reasons for that, to do with not wanting to associate themselves with losers, the whole perception of weakness in men who are struggling, and the fact that professional men who've got the resources, will go in and fight their battles with, using lawyers, whether it's family law or some other area of the law, and then they'll hopefully do okay if they're well resourced, and then they come out the other side and they don't go near men's issues ever again. Yeah. I mean, years ago, I was, when I was involved in government committees in the John Howard era, I used to be just amazed looking at the advocacy of the women's groups, these powerful women's groups with innumerable professional men producing these wonderful documents. Often this was sort of husband-sponsored advocacy. These were married women or partnered women who weren't working full-time and who could afford to devote themselves to this. And, unlike the men who are usually struggling to still earn an income after divorce or through divorce, and they're not in a bit, that's one of the other issues that, particularly in the early days of the women's movement, there were still a lot of women who were able to depend on a husband's income to do all this work. But boy, were they good at it. And then they just churned it all out. And the guys, would send in their individual submissions, pages and pages of this stuff. And I always described it as like a lone little mosquito throwing himself at a mighty mozzie zapper, and these little mosquitoes just bounced off dead. That's what it was. It was a lay down.
And you make a really, really good point actually there about the fact that this has, to a large degree, been funded by wealthy men who are out there working probably long hours, giving their wives the freedom to pursue these sort of policies.
Yeah, and I've had these powerful men creep up. Often I'll be in a situation and someone will come up to me and say, you're quite right. I was absolutely stunned when I found myself shut out of my home when my wife decided, to get rid of me, and I couldn't, I got taken away by the police. I mean, when powerful men find this happens to them, they're absolutely shocked. They're absolutely gobsmacked that there's no, at how our whole, for instance, criminal justice system has been weaponized against me, and that the police aren't interested in their stories, that the police aren't interested in charging her with perjury. All these big issues, assumptions we make about our justice system have totally changed, and we've all just had our head in the sand, haven't we?
That's right. And in fact, you've actually talked to some police in recent times, and they've made it very clear as how difficult it is to actually affect change internally.
Yeah, well, I've always had police contacting me. Okay, there's some crappy police who treat men very badly, but there are lots of decent people in the police force who are aware that they're being required to enforce unjust laws. And they don't like having to go into a home and having no choice but to believe the victim, alleged victim, to believe what the woman is saying, even though there's no evidence to support, her allegation about violence or rape or whatever it is. And they find it really offensive to be put in that situation. I wrote recently about a police union that spoke up, which I think is quite funny, really. They spoke up because they found their own members of the police force were finding themselves amongst the accused with false domestic violence allegations, which is, it's about time, I say. Nothing makes the police, actually realise there is a problem out there than having the tables turned on them. Anyway, it was pretty funny because the union started to speak out about this problem of false allegations, and of course they got hammered by the local women's groups, and so it went on. But I thought it was quite an encouraging sign. Anything, where the cracks start to emerge in the edifice, and at least it gives me some momentary pleasure.
So you mentioned earlier about false accusations. Now, feminists claim that false accusations are rare. They often quote figures like 2% or 8%. Eugene Kanan found 41% in a groundbreaking study in the Midwestern US. Some researchers have found rates that are higher. How common do you think false accusations are?
Well, I think they're very common. The policewoman I interviewed recently, I made a YouTube video with her, said she saw many more false allegations than she did real, whether it was domestic violence cases or rape cases. She, most of her work involved dealing with what she regarded as false allegations, where there was no proof of the accusations coming from the woman. And of course, we know perfectly well that the police are under orders not to take action if someone is found to have lied in the court, to have made false allegations. Now, I'm sure many people know I've been working for the last year with an organisation we set up called Mothers of Sons, which was an attempt to use the fact that our society is supposed to believe women. So we thought we'll get mothers, we'll get women to speak out about what's happening to men, namely their sons. And we thought it might give us some traction with mainstream media, using these women to tell incredible stories of the injustices their sons have faced. And of course, what we found is the mainstream media isn't remotely interested in this group of women, the mothers. So that we're looking for other strategies now. But in this case, one of the mums we featured was a woman whose son was accused of rape when he was an 18-year-old. Terrible story. His 18th birthday, and he ends up in a girl's apartment, totally pissed. Can't remember anything. Next thing, she comes along with a rape accusation, and her case absolutely unravelled in court. They found DNA evidence of 2 other males in her vagina, and not the accused, not the son of our mum. And when that woman walked out of this courtroom, when the mother and her son walked out of the courtroom, The jury stood there applauding this kid because they were so shocked to see what he'd been through. I mean, terrible ordeal. He was in prison for a bit, you know, you name it, because of this woman's pack of lies. And she was trying to get out of the fact that she'd been two-timing her boyfriend, and she got caught out. Now that this family tried desperately to get that young woman charged for perjury, and the police emphatically told this family they're not allowed to charge people with false accusation. That's the rule. That is the rule in our criminal justice system across the country.
That's right.
And we're not allowed to get false allegations. And then the feminists can say, oh, there aren't any of this, you know.
Yeah.
So it goes on.
It's extremely rare for anyone to be charged with a false accusation. Absolutely.
Well, maybe that's the problem. Maybe the feminists are saying, oh, it's very rare because we can't come and do anything about it. Like, we just stopped. We just like, you're not allowed to report it. You're not allowed to, I would sue them. If it was about my son, I would sue them because it was like, you didn't even know what I would do for my kid. And that's what most mothers would be like.
But you can't sue them. You know, I mean, it's all sewn up. We're constantly looking for ways of challenging these decisions in the courts. And, you know, I've got lawyers falling over. I mean, I've got lots of lawyers helping me, which is fantastic. But to get one of these cases up is so difficult. Anyway, we're working on it. I mean, there's a famous case I'm sure people know about called where a woman was charged with false allegations of rape and domestic violence. Her name is Sarah Jane Parkinson. And 60 Minutes did a whole hour on her case because it's so rare. Everybody in the media knows it's really rare for a woman to actually go to prison with false allegations. And this was one of the rare cases, but it took them, this family, you know, over 300,000, their whole life savings went down the gurgle in fighting this case. And they still haven't got any compensation from the government, even though this boy was falsely accused and went to prison. And so it went on.
And we see a lot of cases like that where particularly lately, where the cases are just imploding in court. There was Mark Pearson in the UK who was found not guilty in 90 minutes. There were a series of similar cases where they withdrew the charges in court. Keenan Barsic, I think his pronunciation is his name, in Sydney. So my question is, my next question I want to go on to, is these men that have been falsely accused, they may be found, some of them may serve long periods in jail, some may be released after a shorter time, but that accusation tends to follow them. How do you think they recover over time after it happens?
They never recover. I mean, I just think, every day I receive emails from families whose sons have been accused. I had a long conversation yesterday with someone whose son is in prison for 16 years over a false accusation. And the miscarriage of justice, the way his lawyers let him down is what drives me absolutely crazy. So many criminal lawyers, so many family lawyers are absolutely hopeless, and they don't make any effort to properly defend these men. If you talk to some of the really good criminal defence lawyers, they'll tell you that. This is the worry. I mean, that they're being absolutely, they're lambs to the slaughter. And, you know, other people I've know people who've served prison sentences, who've been released. They're very lucky if they can begin to live a normal life, particularly if it's an accusation that has anything to do with sex. We have this peculiar, in my view, reaction to any sort of sexual crime. Somehow, you know, if it's a crime which involves touching a woman, that is seen as infinitely worse than beating a child half to death or, you know, mistreating children in any other way. I mean, I find it just bizarre. It's something I've never really understood, but, you know, and the talks about pedos and child sex abusers and the way sexual abusers are treated in prisons. I mean, it is just shocking, the treatment of accused men. And
You're
which
absolutely
he
right.
falsely accused men. Yeah.
And we've been seeing changes in evidentiary standards, specifically in relation to sexual offences and so forth. There's things like sex offender registers. Yes, I think our society has, in many ways, made rape worse than murder, and so they're even talked about different courts in some jurisdictions now.
Yeah. And this sort of vigilante justice, where people who serve their sentences are then hounded for the rest of their life with these sort of labels. I've got a man who served a sentence for a sexual accusation, and it was a very minor issue, but he rightly went to prison for that. He's been, had boiling water thrown on him in prison. He can't get a job at all. I mean, he's done his time, and yet he's hiding out, in the middle of nowhere in Australia because he's so afraid of what's happened to him.
And when you get to the point where people can't get a job again, that when men can't get a job, that will then potentially force them back into crime as well.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk about rape culture. Now, you have run this. I think naturally follows on from what we've just been talking about. You've been running campus tours around, I think mostly the East Coast. Is that right?
My campus tours this was about 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah.
They were across Australia. I started out planning to do a national tour. It all got more and more frenetic. I spoke in Melbourne, I spoke at Canberra, I spoke in West Australia, but the Sydney University one was a classic where we had to have the riot squad in to protect me and my audience, because these ferocious young women who are determined not to allow me to speak on campus. What I was speaking about is the fact that our universities have all set up these regulations which amount to kangaroo courts, where young men usually can be accused of sexual assault, and the universities have taken it upon themselves to usurp criminal law and to make decisions to steal these young men's degrees, throw them out of university, a whole range of punishments which are never included in our legislation regarding punishments for sexual assault. We don't say, oh yes, a university can steal a degree. And they've just taken it upon themselves to do this with no proper authority. And I've had a steady stream of young male students come to me over the last few years, particularly after I started speaking out on campus. And we've got a group of lawyers. We've got our first court cases in court now, taking action against the university. So watch this space. I hope I might have good news of finally exposing what's going on in our universities. I actually made a video the other day with the mother of a young man who was so badly treated by his university, thrown out with two hours notice over a totally false accusation that he could easily prove was false, and the university chose not to even discuss it with him. I mean, outrageous treatment. And he's lost a year of his nursing degree. In the end, the girl has withdrawn the accusation, but no repercussions for her. And he's lost the year of his life. He's been publicly disgraced. This is going on everywhere.
Yep. And in fact, that's something that we've been seeing a lot in the US. And yes, we've got a carbon copy of it now, haven't we?
Oh, yeah. I was writing about this when I was still in mainstream media as a full-time journalist. And, you can see my articles 10 years ago saying this is coming to Australia. We are setting this up. In America, did all these fake surveys claiming 1 in 3, 1 in 5 students are sexually assaulted. We did exactly the same thing here. Concocted all this fraudulent data to claim there was a rape crisis on campus. And then we spent $1 million of our taxpayers' money to produce a survey, the Human Rights Commission, which found 0.8% of students report any sort of sexual assault, which could be a stranger touching you up on a train to uni. And what they mainly found was unwanted staring. That was the biggest complaint. But of course, that data came out. I was the only journalist in Australia to write an article saying, let's celebrate our safe universities. Mm. And every other media source beat up this idea of, the universities were unsafe because of this high level of harassment namely unwanted staring. And so it rolled on. We've just now in Australia seen the follow-up survey rolled out in our universities. And someone wrote to me yesterday saying he was absolutely horrified because they sent a copy of he had to fill in that survey, and it's full of stuff about sexual consent. So if you didn't ask for consent all the way, you're told that was sexual assault.
Yep.
Boy, are we going to get great figures this year. We'll have an even better rape crisis than we had 5 years ago. I mean,
and that's actually, of course, a big part of the problem, the fact that the definition of sexual assault has been growing. And I've found examples in Australia and Canada and other countries where kissing is now considered to be a form of sexual assault.
Oh, absolutely. And, sexual consent laws are about women have a right to change their minds afterwards. So even if you had that sign on the dotted line, give consent, that won't help you guys. Afterwards she can say, oh no, that was a mistake.
Absolutely. Every time I've been asked about that, I always say, no, those things aren't worth anything because consent can be withdrawn at any time. And that's even before you start talking about retrospective consent.
That's right.
So speaking of which, I did want to talk a little bit about consent laws. New South Wales has openly stated its intention to implement affirmative consent laws. New South Wales may be the first jurisdiction in the world to do this. Tasmania and Sweden and others have come close, but New South Wales may be the first. That's my opinion. Other people disagree, but I think this is maybe the first place in the world. Do you agree that New South Wales will be the first across the line with affirmative consent?
I'm just trying to think whether I know a lot of other countries are moving this direction. Canada, it's certainly on the drawing board, sexual consent. I don't know, maybe we will be the first. Absolutely ridiculous, dangerous precedent. We had our New South Wales bar, where all the experienced criminal lawyers spoke out and said this is going to be ridiculous, impossible. It means that all normal sexual interactions between couples, between people who are going out together, have the potential to be illegal because people don't ask for consent. They don't want to ask for consent when they're making love to a husband they've been with for 20 years. I mean, all that sort of stuff is just madness, and it's all feminist ideology. And the goal is to get more rape convictions. That's the whole point of it. This constant. I did an interview not so long ago when I put together a video which revolved around a talk by one of our most famous criminal barristers, Margaret Cunneen. And what's important about Margaret is she, for many years, was a prosecutor, a Crown prosecutor. She convicted some of our most hideous rapists in New South Wales, put them behind bars. And then after many years, she's left that role as a defender, and she's now working as a defender of mainly accused men who've been accused of rape. And she gave an amazingly open talk where she pointed out that what's happened in the criminal law system is that that the police and the prosecutors used to be able to sift out cases that weren't strong enough and they wouldn't go through to court. And now they're under orders to just shove everything through because the feminists are putting such pressure on everybody to say, we have to believe anybody who makes an allegation. And of course, some of them still end up being tossed out when it comes by sensible juries. And that means that the feminists can turn around and say our criminal justice system is failing victims. It's a perfect circle. I mean, it's just amazing. Anyway.
It's a win-win. So do you think, so my next question is do you think that they will actually go ahead with this? Do you think they'll actually implement affirmative consent laws in New South Wales?
Oh, well, our very, very woke Attorney General has said it, it's a lay down. There's no question they'll get it through. I mean, this is supposed to be a conservative government in New South Wales, and it's led by this feminist Attorney General, male, who's constantly sucking up to the feminists,
It's extraordinary. And I think we are going to see things that are unprecedented in New South Wales, like even men starting to avoid sex and all sorts of things.
Yeah, and of course we're teaching this in our universities. We're teaching this in our schools now. This notion that if girl has had anything to drink, she cannot give consent. So, with consent, it means the man is doubly responsible. If he's drunk, it doesn't give him an excuse. It just means he's in an impossible situation because he has to make decisions on behalf of her, how much she's had to drink. And he's inevitably responsible if she decides that was rape afterwards.
And this, of course, brings up an important point that the consent of men is completely absent from this conversation at the moment.
Can I ask a question? Like, how is it so? If I was to go out, meet a guy, we both got absolutely wasted, I lived closer, I said, come back to my place, we'll just crash on my bed, and that was my computer.
That's right.
And I said to, we just went to sleep. Like nothing was supposed to happen. He crashes. I start feeling a bit frisky and take advantage of him whilst he's asleep. I'm drunk, he's drunk, but he's the one that doesn't have the right to give or take away consent.
Well, he is responsible for rape in that situation. I mean, maybe. I mean, it depends on what happens in the court. If this ends up as a court case, it depends on how the lawyers play this out. But what's worrying is that the students, the school kids are being taught that in that situation, it's always his responsibility, no matter if you're both drunk or not. Because women are incapable of giving consent when they're drunk, and that does not apply to males.
So the feminists want me to be a strong, independent female until I'm drunk, and then I'm just a useless, stupid woman.
Well, we're inevitably victims in need of protection. I mean, to me, that's one of the most infuriating things about the current cultural moment, is that we've gone from feminism being about empowering women. We are strong, hear us roar. I mean, I was part of that first generation of women in their 70s to reach adulthood in my 70s, and we were just delighting in our independence and the fact that we were given the responsibilities that we hadn't had before. We didn't need protection. We didn't need cosseting. We didn't, we could take our place alongside men. And suddenly we're in a society where we're busily putting women back into that protected, cosseted role. And I just think it's inconceivable to me.
When you sit back and you sort of take a moment and breathe deeply, it really is extraordinary. On top of that, the fact that they're denying the agency of women, which is presumably exactly what the opposite of what the feminist movement claimed to do, they're also starting to increasingly segregate men and women. It's extraordinary.
Oh yeah, so many things about it. Such inconsistencies and lack of logic. And where are all the feminist women who are raising sons? I mean, what are they thinking when they look at the message that's being sent to those young men of growing up in a society where normal male behaviour is demonised and derided in so many ways?
So we've talked a bit about feminism. More generally, political correctness has swept Australia. Many warned about the implications, but were ignored. More recently, it has led to cancel culture and identity politics. So do you think that political correctness, cancel culture and identity politics have damaged Australian society?
Oh, of course they have. I mean, I just think that we're living in a society where a lot of people are really nervous of speaking their mind, particularly publicly, on a whole range of issues. And, gender politics is just one of them. I suppose what makes me cross is even the groups who claim to be very concerned about identity politics. So I suppose you'd probably label them conservative or right-wing groups. They'll talk about, the advocacy over the trans issues, or they'll talk about rape, the craziness around rape or around race. I mean, all that and issues like that. And they hardly ever talk about demonising men. They hardly ever talk about gender politics. It just doesn't rate. And yet that's up there probably with a greater grip on our society than any other area of identity politics. I mean, race is not such a huge issue in Australia as it is obviously in America and probably Britain. And gender politics should be right up there as a topic of concern for groups who are worried about the impact of all of this on our society. But men just never, you look at Sky News, you look at the places who are talking about this broader issue of political correctness, they don't talk about men ever.
Absolutely right. In actual fact, we who are talking about men's issues are often labelled as right-wing or alt-right or extreme right. In actual fact, my experience is the people who are talking about it actually come from across the political divide, because there are people on both ends who see the problem and are trying to speak out, but we're a small minority.
Absolutely.
So I guess my next question is, can we come back from this? The society has been harmed. Can we come back? Can we recover?
I must say I'm in a bit of pessimistic phase. I mean, I've always been the world's biggest optimist, but look, it's been a difficult, as many people will know. I've had a really difficult few years, and my optimism has taken a distinct denting recently. I don't know how we're going to come back from it. I can't see it. I'm rather sad about the fact is I don't think probably not going to be in my lifetime. And I worry about my kids. I worry about where this is all going. I don't know what would turn it around.
I'm afraid I tend to agree. In fact, it's a common problem among people who are talking about men's issues that a lot of us actually sort of get quite despondent about it, because although there are some wins now and again, it is on a national level or an international level, I think it's probably going to be very hard, unfortunately.
It is.
So
I just want to say, can I just talk about, for people who don't know, I had this sort of really ironic thing happen to me, because last year I was given an award by the government, an honours award, and it was framed in terms of, supporting the community, supporting the community work through promoting gender equity through advocacy for men, which admittedly was pretty provocative, but it summed up what I think I've been doing for 20 years. And I think in a way it was pretty flattering, because boy, did the feminist movement flex their muscles. They just took me out. They rolled out the really big guns. I had 2 attorneys general. I had the whole Australian Senate. I had prominent person after prominent person lined up to attack me. We've just been talking about the New South Wales Attorney General, Mark Speakman. He spread a whole list of lies about, where they'd put together quotes from videos I'd made or articles I'd produced, whatever, tiny little, cherry-pick quotes, misinformation. And here it is, this Attorney General pouring out all this lies about me. Anyway, it was a pile-on that actually is as bad as anyone's ever seen, they tell me in Australia. The Governor-General's office said there's never been a fuss like that. It was a defining cultural moment in their view, because they've never had so many people on both sides. I mean, people attacking me, they got the feminists, the Twitterati got, people complaining from one end of the country to the other. But all my people did come forward and defend me. And it was this almighty battle, which I won, of course, because there was never any question they were not going to take the award away from me. But boy, they really worked very hard to damage my reputation in the process. And it speaks to the fact, and what's exciting about it, it means I was getting somewhere, doesn't it? They wouldn't have made such an effort if I wasn't over the target and achieving some really major goals. I'd been, out there on the campuses exposing what they were doing there, And we'd been running all sorts of other campaigns. They hated the fact that I was constantly pointing out their lies around domestic violence and exposing this fraudulent industry, and on any number of topics. Anyway, it was, so it's, I don't know what it says, but it certainly says, that I had achieved something and I really mattered to the feminists, and I was so dangerous, they had to get rid of me. Well, they haven't got rid of me because I'm still here, but they've certainly shut me out very effectively in mainstream media, which has been pretty depressing because, all these people who every night talk about freedom and identity politics and so on, they won't let me near those programs. So they've wimped out across the board.
Yeah, particularly when you consider that you've been known in Australia for decades. So it is absolutely extraordinary. It shows the power. We were impressed, but also amazed when the award was made. It's absolutely fabulous. And then of course when they in the end they weren't able to change the committee's position, which is absolutely fantastic.
Well, so, to have an award taken away from you, you have to have committed a criminal offence. Clearly, I hadn't done that, so it's obvious from the beginning they couldn't. But they were just trying to damage my reputation in any conceivable way.
Yes.
And, they've taken over my wiki page. All sorts of things that are infuriating. But, that's the way it is.
Absolutely. I mean, we've known each other for a number of years now, and we were in touch during that period. And I think to audiences anyone watching from overseas, I think you can't really understand what it was like here. It was absolutely extraordinary. And at a personal level, I really felt bad. I knew that it was a lot coming on you, and I really felt bad.
Well, it was terrible. I mean, the worst thing is in the end they attacked my children, which is why I decided to get off social media. That helped me lead to the whole thing of setting up Mothers of Sons, which is fine. So I'm doing helping with Mothers of Sons, put all the news stories and things I used to put out there myself. I'm now putting up through Mothers of Sons, which is fine. But it did take a real toll, and it was, very tough.
Absolutely. So I wanted to move on to one other topic before we finish up. We've got a few more minutes left. So the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, an organisation we all know and love. For those who don't know, overseas, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation doesn't do commercial advertising. It is actually funded by the government. I think it's some amount per day per taxpayer, 80 cents or something along those lines that every taxpayer pays per day. At ICMI 17, you said that you felt the Australian Broadcasting Corporation was in breach of its charter. Do you think this has become better, stayed the same, or become worse?
Oh, I think the ABC is totally lawless, absolutely off the rails now. When I talked about it being in breach of its charter, I wrote to the then CEO. What's his CEO? I think the person who runs it. I can't remember. Is that the right?
Maybe, yes.
I can't remember that. Anyway, an old friend of mine, Mark Scott, and I said, perfectly, when they talk about bias in the ABC, they always talk about 5 minutes from politicians of each side. Do they give them equal time? And everybody knows that's not the real issue. It's what they won't talk about. That they will never discuss funding for domestic violence, and the fact that our domestic violence plan has been shown to have spent $3 billion over the last decade and to have not had any effect. Now, the ABC will never run that story. ABC will never run stories about men being falsely accused or the proper, all the things we've been talking about, the ABC won't touch. And they will just lie and misrepresent and promote total misinformation and never get called out, and they use their own money to defend journalists who've been caught out lying, and so it goes on. It's a totally corrupted organisation now.
All on the government's dime, that's right, all on our tax dollars.
Yeah, well, it's just one of many institutions that have been absolutely corrupted. And in this case, I, of course, am most concerned by feminism and the influence of the feminist ideology on the ABC, but that's only one of many areas where they aren't presenting the truth anymore. It's not true of the whole ABC. There are local stations that still do a very good job, particularly in terms of, when we are going through a fire season or whatever, local disaster or presenting local news. But the big ABC programs are an absolute joke.
Absolutely. I've personally had some interaction with the ABC, and I have to say my experience has been that ABC radio probably isn't as bad as ABC TV. I don't know what your feeling is, but that's sort of been my feeling. Okay, fair enough.
No, well, look, I was on the ABC probably every week of my life for 30 years.
Yep.
And the more I started to speak out about men, the less popular I became. They loved me when I talked about sex. But, and then they were very much part of the attack on me. They led the attack really on me last year, promoting. There was one notable occasion when we were about to go out to dinner and my partner was watching TV before we went out, and the ABC led their whole weekend programming with someone attacking me and denouncing me. This was like 2 weeks into the campaign, 2 months into the campaign against me. They spent a whole weekend with some new person they'd rolled out claiming that they should give back my award. It was the lead item on the news. The marvelous thing for me was that COVID saved me, because of when this terrible virus came along, it pushed me off the front pages. I mean, how could they talk about this trivia when they were faced with a genuine problem? I was the only person in the world saved by COVID.
I never thought of that.
It's fantastic.
So we've just about run out of time. So thank you very much. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Bettina. Really appreciate your appearing.
Natalie, nice to talk to you. I know, very hard to get a word in edgewise when I'm on my
No. It's been my pleasure. It's been a learning experience for me.
Thank you. Rob, nice to talk to you.
Great to talk to you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.